It was the long weekend in May, the one Canadians treat like the unofficial start of summer even when the weather hasn't quite committed to the idea yet. I had the back deck swept, the propane tank checked, and a rack of ribs marinating since the night before. My son Daniel, he's 36 now, works in cybersecurity out of Waterloo, had called the week before to say he wanted to bring someone special. That word, special. I've been a widower for 9 years, so I know what that word costs a son to say to his father. It costs him something. My wife Patricia died in 2015. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Daniel was 27 when we lost her. He took it the way young men take that kind of loss, quietly and badly, and mostly alone. He threw himself into work, moved cities twice, dated here and there but never brought anyone home. Not once in 9 years. Until now. So I said, bring her. Of course. Come Sunday. I'll say this about myself so you understand what comes next. I spent 22 years with the RCMP, the last 11 of those in financial crimes. After I took my pension, I did another decade as a private consultant fraud prevention, mostly for credit unions and insurance firms across Ontario and BC. I've sat across the table from con artists so polished they made you feel lucky to know them. I've watched people, smart people, educated people, people who should have known better hand over their savings with a smile. The best ones don't feel like fraud while they're happening. They feel like opportunity. I retired properly 3 years ago. I have a house in Guelph, a woodworking shop in the garage, and a garden that Patricia would have had strong opinions about. I try to stay useful. I read. I sleep well. Mostly. I had not told Daniel exactly what I did for those 22 years. He knew I was RCMP. He thought financial crimes meant embezzlement cases and corporate paperwork. I let him think that. Patricia and I decided early on that some of what I saw at work was not something we wanted living in our house on the weekends. There are pictures a father doesn't bring home to dinner. So when Daniel called and said special, I cleaned up the deck and I marinated the ribs and I told myself to be a normal person for one afternoon. They arrived around noon. Her name was Renee Fontaine. She was 41, Daniel's age roughly, French-Canadian by her accent, though she'd clearly lived in English Canada long enough that she code-switched without thinking about it. She had dark hair pulled back, wore a light linen blazer despite the warmth, and when she shook my hand, she held eye contact about 4 seconds longer than most people do. Not rude, just deliberate. She brought wine. Good wine, not the kind you grab at the LCBO on the way, the kind with a French label and a story attached, which she told briefly and gracefully, and then moved on from. Daniel was different with her. Looser in the shoulders. He laughed more easily. He touched her arm when he pointed something out in the garden, the small unconscious gesture of someone who'd been reaching for this person long enough that it had become reflex. I noticed that. It made me glad and careful at the same time. We ate on the deck. The ribs came out well. Renee had two, complimented the dry rub, specifically not just delicious, but the spice balance, which told me she cooked. We talked about Daniel's work, about a project I was finishing in the shop, about the garden. She asked about Patricia gently, and when I answered, she didn't rush to fill the silence after. That's a skill. Not everyone has it. About an hour in, she set down her fork, reached into her blazer pocket, and placed a business card on the table beside Daniel's plate. It was thick cardstock, cream-colored, simple font, René Fontaine. Principal, Meridian Bridge Capital. Then a Toronto address and a phone number. I've been wanting to say something properly, she said, looking at me, and I keep starting and stopping, so I'm just going to say it. I know Daniel hasn't brought anyone home in a long time. I know what that means. And I want you to know I understand that this, she touched her own card lightly, is separate from that. I don't mix those things. I said that was thoughtful of her to say. She smiled. He warned me you were perceptive. We kept eating. Daniel poured more wine. Renee and I talked about the investment landscape in the Waterloo corridor, about the lithium supply chain, about a development project she was involved with in Muskoka. She knew her material. She was fluent without being showy. But there was a moment small, almost nothing, when she asked me whether I'd done anything with the equity in the house since Patricia passed, whether I'd thought about what I wanted the asset to do in the next 10 years. It was casual, conversational. But it was the third time that afternoon she'd circled back to the house. I answered without answering. A skill I have. After dessert, Daniel offered to help me with the dishes. Renee said she'd love to look at the garden properly if I didn't mind, and she stepped off the deck onto the lawn with her wine glass. In the kitchen, Daniel handed me plates and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "She's incredible, isn't she?" I said she was impressive. He said, "She's been helping me look at a real estate opportunity, a development up in Muskoka, condo units, pre-construction. She says the return window is tight, but the fundamentals are really strong." I kept washing. He said, "I'm thinking about putting in a significant amount, like a significant portion of what I have saved." I turned off the tap. "How much is significant?" He told me. It was the number you work a decade in cybersecurity to have. It was most of what he had. I looked at him. He was looking out the window at Renee in the garden. "Dad," he said quietly, not looking at me, "I know what you're going to say." I said I hadn't said anything yet. "She's legitimate. I've seen the documents. The project is real. I've done my research." I said that was good. I said I was sure he had. And then I started the tap again. He went back out before I was finished. When I came out with the coffee, Renee was showing him something on her phone, a rendering of some kind, glass and steel against a lake view. He was nodding. She looked up at me and smiled. Perfect timing. That night, I sat in my shop for an hour before I went to bed. I was not panicking. I want to be clear about that. I was thinking, methodically, the way I was trained to think. You don't panic when you've spent 2 decades watching people get taken. You get very quiet instead. Meridian Bridge Capital. I wrote the name on a piece of paper. The next morning, I called a woman I used to work with. Lynn. She's been in financial intelligence with FinTrack for 15 years now, and she owes me a favor I've never collected. I asked her to do a name search and a corporate registry pull. Nothing formal. Just a look. She called me back in 2 hours. Meridian Bridge Capital was incorporated in Ontario 13 months ago. 1 director. The registered address was a mail forwarding service on King Street West in Toronto. No audited financials filed. No securities registration in any province. "Is there a development project in Muskoka?" I asked. "There's a numbered company that owns a parcel," she said. 12 acres on a lake near Port Carling. No building permits pulled. No development application on file with the municipality. I thanked her and hung up. Then I made a second call. To a former colleague in BC who now works financial fraud privately. He ran the name Renee Fontaine against complaint databases, civil court records, and a few other things I won't specify here. It took him until the following day. He found 2 prior complaints, one in Alberta, one in Quebec. Both involved early-stage investment opportunities in real estate development. Both involved significant personal funds transferred by the mark before the project dissolved. In the Alberta case, a man in his 60s had sold a secondary property to invest. In the Quebec case, the victim was a recently widowed woman who had liquidated a portion of her RRSP. Neither case had resulted in charges. Renee Fontaine, or the woman using that name, was good at staying just below the threshold where things become criminal rather than merely civil. I sat with that for a while. Here's what I knew. My son was in love, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter yet. He was going to hand over most of what he'd saved to a woman who had done this before, to people who were vulnerable in specific ways she understood how to identify. And he had no idea. And if I came at him directly, if I said I made calls, I pulled records, here's what I found: there was a real chance he would defend her. That's what people do. They defend the person they've chosen. They find reasons. And in defending her, he might warn her, which would give her time to move. I needed to let him find it. Or I needed to be present when the documents came out. I called Daniel and asked if he wanted to come for dinner that Friday. Just the 2 of us. He said yes. Then I asked if Renee might come as well. I said I'd enjoyed meeting her and wanted to get to know her better. He sounded pleased. He said he'd ask. She came. I made pasta. Simple. I opened the wine she'd brought the weekend before. About an hour in, I said to Renee, "I've been thinking more about what you mentioned, about the Muskoka project. I have some equity in this house that's essentially sitting. Patricia and I never got around to doing much with it. I'd be interested to understand the structure better. She did not change expression, but something in her settled, the way a cat settles when a bird lands nearby. She pulled out her laptop. Clean slide deck, good design, projections, photographs of the land, architectural renderings. She walked me through the investment structure, a limited partnership, a 3-year horizon, projected returns in the range of 22 to 27%. I asked questions, specific ones, slowly. What was the name of the general partner entity? Could I see the offering memorandum? Had this been reviewed by the OSC? Who was the law firm handling the LP agreements? She answered smoothly. The general partner was a numbered company. The offering memorandum was in final review. OSC registration was pending. The law firm was a name I didn't recognize. The thing is, I said, 27% over 3 years on a pre-construction project assumes permits and timelines that aren't always realistic in Muskoka. The municipality up there has been quite restrictive. I'd want to see the development application on file. She said the applications were submitted, and she expected approval within the quarter. I looked at her. I checked the municipal website yesterday. There's no application on file for that parcel. A beat, very short. There may be a lag in the public listing, she said. These things update slowly. There's also no OSC registration for Meridian Bridge Capital in any province, I said, and the incorporated address is a mail service, not an office. Daniel put down his fork. Renee looked at me steadily. She was deciding something. I also spoke to a woman in Edmonton, I said, whose father lost $400,000 in a development project that had the same structure as this one. Different company name, same story. The room was very quiet. Who are you? She said. It wasn't angry. It was almost professional. I told her, not everything, just enough. RCMP financial crimes for 22 years, a decade of consulting after. Enough cases to know exactly what Meridian Bridge Capital was and what she was. She closed the laptop. She picked up her bag. She looked at Daniel and said his name once, softly, like an apology that hadn't quite formed, and then she walked out of my kitchen. I heard the front door. I did not move. Daniel didn't either. After a while, he said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since Monday." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, because he needed to be in the room when it happened. Because if I'd told him over the phone, he would have had a conversation with her that I couldn't control, and she would have had an explanation ready, and maybe he would have believed it. I said I was sorry for doing it that way. I said I didn't know a better one. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet I recognized from when his mother died. He was processing something too large for words to catch up to. Finally, he said, "How much did she want?" I said as much as he had, probably. Maybe more if she'd gotten the house into it. He put his face in his hands. I got up and refilled his water glass and sat back down. I didn't say anything. Sometimes you don't say anything. After a while, he looked up and said, "You were RCMP financial crimes." I said yes. "For 22 years." I said yes. "You investigated fraud." I said that was most of it. He said, "You let me think you did paperwork." I said his mother and I had decided early that the work was that some of it was better left at the office. I said I had seen things that I didn't want to come home with me, and I had tried to keep that boundary clean. He thought about that. Then he said, "Were you good at it?" I said I'd like to think so. He almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and something else. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "She seemed so real," he said. I said that was the whole job. I said the best ones always did. We sat for a while longer. The pasta went cold. Neither of us moved to do anything about it. Eventually, Daniel asked what happened now, whether she would be charged. I said I'd already forwarded what I had to a contact at the OPP Financial Crimes Unit and a colleague who dealt with cross-provincial fraud. The 2 prior complaints, combined with a documented attempt here, gave investigators something to work with. It wasn't guaranteed. Cases like this were hard to prosecute, but there was a file now, and a file had a way of following people. "The man in Edmonton," Daniel said. "The woman's father." I said yes. "Did he lose everything?" I said most of it. He was 73. He'd sold a cabin his parents had built. Daniel was quiet again. Then he said, "You saved me from that." I didn't say anything. He said, Dad. I looked at him. He said, "Thank you." I told him not to thank me. I told him that was the job. The first job. The one that mattered more than the one I got paid for. He came around the table and put his hand on my shoulder and stood there for a moment, the way men do when they mean something they don't quite have the language for. Then he picked up the pasta bowls and took them to the kitchen, and I heard the tap running, and after a while I got up and went to help. That was 8 months ago. The woman I know as Renee Fontaine has not been charged yet. These things take time, but I understand the investigation is active, and there is a second individual being looked at in connection with the numbered companies. I don't ask for more detail than that. Daniel came back to Guelph for Christmas. He brought 2 bottles of wine and a piece of pottery he'd made in a class he'd apparently been taking. He mentioned it the way people mention things they expect you to make fun of, half defensive, half proud. It was a bowl, roughly cylindrical, slightly lopsided, and clearly made with actual effort. I put it on the shelf in the kitchen, where I keep the things that matter. We didn't talk about Renee, not directly. But on Boxing Day, when we were sitting on the deck in our coats because neither of us wanted to go in yet, he said, "I should have trusted what I felt." Something felt off from the beginning, and I kept talking myself out of it. I said that was almost universal. I said I had spent 22 years watching intelligent people do exactly that. He said, "Is that why you stayed quiet at first? You wanted me to trust myself?" I thought about that. I said that was part of it. I said the other part was that I had underestimated maybe how far along it had gone. He nodded. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about? That guy in Edmonton. The cabin." I said I thought about him too. "I want to do something," Daniel said. "I don't know what. Something." I said I'd give him the name of a legal fund that supported fraud victims in civil recovery cases. I said they could always use volunteers with his kind of technical background. A lot of fraud had a digital component now, and investigators were perpetually short on people who understood that side. He looked at me. "Is that what you did? After you retired?" I said some of it. Some of it was just woodworking and a badly managed garden. He laughed at that. A real one. I'm not someone who talks about what I feel without a reason to. But sitting there with my son on the deck in December, coats on, mugs going cold, I thought about Patricia and what she would have made of all of it. The woman at the dinner table, the file I'd sent to the OPP, the bowl on the kitchen shelf. I think she would have said I did all right. I think she would have made me describe the bowl in more detail than I was comfortable with and then declared it charming. I miss her the way I miss parts of myself, quietly and all the time, and without expecting it to stop. But there's this. My son knows who his father is now. Not all of it, but enough. And I know he'll come back to Guelph, and he'll bring bad wine sometimes and probably good wine sometimes, and we'll sit on this deck until it gets too cold, and neither of us will want to be the first one to go in. That's enough. That is more than enough. I've thought a lot about what makes someone like Renee so effective. It wasn't the slide deck, and it wasn't the wine she brought, and it wasn't even the way she held eye contact a beat too long. It was the fact that she understood people. She understood that a son who hadn't brought anyone home in 9 years would be disarmed by his own hope. She understood that a recently retired man living alone in a house too big for one person might be lonely enough to want to believe in something. She read the room perfectly. She just didn't know who else was in it. That's the thing about choosing to harm people. You get good at reading vulnerability, but you also develop blind spots because you start to believe that everyone is operating from the same place you are, that everyone is calculating, that everyone has an angle. It didn't occur to her that I had spent 22 years learning to see exactly what she was, and that I was sitting across the table from her with that knowledge in my back pocket, waiting. The very skill that made her dangerous made her assume I was manageable. That assumption was what finished her. Daniel told me months later that he'd felt something was off almost from the beginning. Not anything he could name. Just a small, persistent discomfort he kept talking himself out of, kept filing under. You're being paranoid. You're self-sabotaging. You don't know how to let someone in. He's 36. He's been building his own life for a long time, and that means he's also built up a considerable amount of self-doubt disguised as self-awareness. Renee knew how to use that too. What I keep coming back to is this. The discomfort was right. The thing Daniel felt and overrode and argued himself away from that was accurate information. The problem wasn't that he lacked intelligence. He's one of the sharpest people I know. The problem was that he hadn't yet learned to trust his own perception when it conflicted with what he wanted to be true. That's not a character flaw. That's just something most people have to learn the hard way. And I'm grateful beyond what I can easily say that he didn't have to learn it at full cost. I think about the man in Edmonton, 73 years old, selling a cabin his parents built. I think about him a lot. He had the same feeling, probably. That small, persistent discomfort. And nobody was sitting at the table with him. I'm not a sentimental person by nature. I don't talk easily about what I feel, and I've made peace with that limitation. But what I know is this. The choices we make about who we protect and how we spend our time and what we decide to carry quietly so that the people we love don't have to those choices accumulate into something. They become the actual record of a life, not the title on a business card, not the number of cases closed, the actual record. Daniel put a lopsided bowl on my shelf, and it's still there. That's where I leave it.